This is a skull of Homo heidelbergensis, the first ever known murderer in prehistoric human history. And this is how they did it. It's me, and this is my channel. This is one of the most important archaeological discoveries in recent years. But before we get into it, let's talk about today's sponsor. The very first members of our genus Homo that evolved in Africa around 2.8 million years ago were small proto-humans with brains barely larger than a chimpanzee. Over hundreds of thousands of years, different species of early humans spread out across the old world. Some went extinct, and others continued to evolve into the modern humans we are today. One of these species was Homo heidelbergensis, a stocky, muscular hominin with a large brain that lived in Europe and parts of Africa between about 700,000 and 200,000 years ago. We know they lived in social groups because once in a while they left behind butchered animal bones that have been gnawed clean, suggesting a communal meal. But other than that, their daily lives remain mysterious. That is until now. In 2016, an amateur archaeologist in Spain named Jose Maria Berendero discovered a fossilized skull in the northeast of the country in a region known as the Iberian Peninsula. It was hidden beneath some rocks at the bottom of a ravine, and at first glance it didn't look particularly special. There was no jawbone, and what remained of the skull had been heavily weathered, but something about it seemed odd. So Berendero took a closer look. When he brushed away the dirt, he revealed the back of a hole punched through the left side of the skull. It was uncaused by a rock or a wild animal, because those would have fractured the bone instead of making a clean round hole. But this was obviously made by something sharp, like a stone tool. And if it was caused by a blow from a sharp object, then whoever dealt this fatal blow would have been sitting pretty close to their victim. It would have happened at close range. Heidelbergensis skulls aren't exactly rare finds. Around 40 have been unearthed in Spain alone. They're so common that archaeologists have even given them a nickname, the man from Sima. That, as after the Spanish word for pit, since many of them have been found at the bottom of ravines. But this one was different. This was the first skull ever found with evidence of interpersonal violence. And the more researchers examined it, the more details they uncovered. Using a scanning electron microscope, they found microscopic traces of another kind of damage to the left side of the skull. If you look closely, you can see a series of fine lines radiating outward from the impact hole, like cracks in a windshield. These lines weren't visible with the naked eye, but under the microscope, they were obvious. Even more intriguing, they resembled the microscopic patterns left behind when modern humans get hit in the head with a rock. Basically, this wasn't just a regular old hole. Someone had smashed this guy's skull in with a rock and killed him. But who was this victim? Was he a Heidelbergensis or a member of a different ancient human species? After all, our ancestors lived alongside Neanderthals and Denisovans, two of our closest relatives, during the Middle Paleolithic, the time period in which this skull was found. Although genetic evidence suggests that interbreeding between modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans was common, they still retained many distinct physical characteristics. For example, Neanderthals were shorter and stockier than us with larger brains, prominent brow ridges, and huge noses. Judging by the size and shape of the skull, this individual wasn't a Neanderthal. It was probably a Heidelbergensis. But that still doesn't explain why somebody would want to kill one of their own. After all, our ancestors weren't exactly known for their violent tendencies. In fact, scientists used to think that the Middle Paleolithic was a peaceful time. Tools from this era aren't nearly as sharp or refined as the ones that came later. And generally speaking, humans have only gotten more violent over time. So why was this one little group of Heidelbergensis acting like a bunch of psychopaths? Well, there are two possibilities here. Either they randomly murdered one of their own, or they killed someone from a different species. Of course, if this had been a Neanderthal, we probably would have seen signs of struggle. They might have had defensive wounds or injuries to their head and torso. But this individual appears to have died instantly. The killer must have struck them with enough force to smash their skull, but also from close enough of a range to make sure they wouldn't survive. There isn't any trauma to the rest of the skeleton, so it likely happened without warning. Whoever was responsible for this had the element of surprise. And although this person may not have been a Neanderthal, that doesn't mean they didn't know violence. Remember that our ancestors weren't exactly pacifists. They hunted big game, lived in tight social groups, and used spears to take down prey. Plus, other groups of Heidelbergensis in southern Africa had a taste for cannibalism. Not only did they eat their own kind, they showed a preference for the meat of children and pregnant women. So while we might think of Neanderthals as inherently more violent than modern humans, things weren't necessarily that simple. It's true that they buried their dead, which suggests a certain level of compassion. But they also occasionally crushed the skulls of their enemies, maybe even as a ritualistic display of dominance. So it's totally plausible that this murder was a product of interspecies violence. But that brings up another question. Who would have done such a thing? Some scientists think it might have been a member of a different human species, like a Neanderthal. But that doesn't make much sense. Why would a Neanderthal kill a Heidelbergensis? They were too closely related to each other for there to be any real animosity. Unless they belonged to separate social groups, it seems unlikely that this was an act of interspecies violence. That means we're left with the crazy idea that this was a case of fratricide, a brother killing his brother. And to be honest, that makes a lot of sense. You see, Heidelbergensis wasn't just one single species. Different groups spread out across Europe and Africa evolved independently of one another. At some point, they diverged so much that we actually split the species into two: Homo heidelbergensis and Homo heidelbergensis rhodesiensis. And according to lead author of the study, Juan Luis Arzuaga, the victim was almost certainly a member of the former group. Because of its larger brain, heavier build, and robust teeth, he was definitely a Heidelbergensis from the West. But the perpetrator would have belonged to the latter group, the one that evolved in Central and Eastern Africa, the one we actually share most of our DNA with. In other words, the perpetrator was our direct ancestor, the one that eventually gave rise to modern humans. But why would they kill a relative? Well, imagine if the dawn of humanity happened in the middle of the Cold War. You could have the Soviets on one side and Americans on the other. In that scenario, it wouldn't be unheard of for soldiers to kill people simply because they were on the other team. And something similar might have happened here. Maybe the two groups of Heidelbergensis were so genetically distant from one another that they no longer recognized each other as kin. Or maybe they were in conflict over resources. If that's the case, then it wouldn't be a stretch to say that they were capable of killing one another. Either way, this murder is one of the first pieces of evidence we have for just how complex the story of humanity really is. And it's one of the few times we can study violence among our extinct relatives. The truth is, these kinds of discoveries are incredibly rare. Usually the only evidence we find are bone fragments that have been gnawed on, but rarely do we uncover the whole picture. Most of the time, the skulls and skeletons of our ancestors are completely intact, with almost no sign of trauma. And that makes sense. After all, bones heal, and if we don't have the technology to peer inside of them, we won't be able to tell that they've ever been broken. But every once in a while, an individual will turn up that has a piece of their past life still embedded inside of their bones. And that's where science comes in. If we examine these bones under the right equipment, we can see microscopic fractures that are invisible to the naked eye. By looking at these patterns, scientists can figure out exactly how and when they died. Were they stabbed, bludgeoned, or shot? And how far away from their killer were they when it happened? Did they have a chance to defend themselves, or were they taken by surprise? Every impact leaves a unique signature in the microscopic structure of bones and teeth, allowing scientists to reconstruct the life and death of individuals from hundreds of thousands of years ago. And as technology improves, we'll be able to learn even more about our ancestors. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll be able to read their DNA and solve some of the biggest mysteries of the distant past. Thanks again to Brilliant for supporting this C-Show video, and thanks to you for watching.